This lesson is on Chapter 2 and it covers the Constitution. Chapter 2 will cover four main topics: how the separation of powers and checks and balances both help and hinder policymaking, the fundamental compromises that went into the framing of the Constitution, both the formal and informal amending process, and why the informal process is used the most to change both the meaning of the Constitution and its spirit. And then lastly, the importance of the Bill of Rights and why it now applies to the states. So you'll have a much deeper understanding of selective incorporation, or in this case, the incorporation doctrine. First, we'll be reviewing some history. Most of this history you've probably covered in your U.S. history class last year. The creation of the Constitution was the result of a number of different factors. First, we can consider the colonists rising up against the British because of imposed unfair taxes and laws. As colonists fought for their independence in the Revolutionary War, even in establishing that independence and creating the Articles of Confederation, we find that there were major weaknesses and challenges of that first document. It will be important for you to talk about the challenges of the Articles of Confederation. In understanding the fight for independence against the British, we can understand why the Articles were structured in the way that they were. So the colonists distrusted having a strong central government, and instead they preferred to have a limited government, and they gave the states a lot of power. Even though the colonies came together under one nation, the US, they acted more so as individual entities, almost like separate countries. They were more of a league of friendship than any kind of unified government. The most impactful event that brought attention to the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation was Shays' Rebellion. As you learned about in U.S. history, farmer and war veteran Daniel Shay led hundreds of debt-burdened rebels in protests at Massachusetts courthouses, closing them down and burning debtor records. Protesters spread to other states, and Congress voted to establish a national army. They requested that each state provide money to pay for it, but only the state of Virginia agreed to provide the requested money. This event threatened the security of the entire nation, primarily because it was a rebellion that was domestic and also brought attention to the fact that the nation was not prepared for a possible invasion of a foreign country. This demonstrated weaknesses of a confederal system, like barriers to developing any kind of national economic policies, and the inability to create a strong defense against domestic uprisings as well as international uprisings. In addition to the challenges of struggling to raise money federally, in addition to being able to raise an army, there were some other challenges to the Articles of Confederation as well, mainly when looking at the structure of the Articles. So, first off, there was only one governing body in the national government. Congress was unicameral as opposed to bicameral like we see today. Each state also had 2 to 7 delegates in Congress, but only one vote. In addition, you needed 9 out of 13 of the states to approve policies or laws, as well as ratify treaties. And you needed 13 out of the 13 states, that's all of them, to amend the Articles of Confederation. So it was virtually impossible to make any changes. We can also point to some challenges with economic policy. Several states had their own currency, and they often taxed one another very heavily. Congress didn't have the authority also to collect taxes. And so without the ability for Congress to collect taxes, the federal government couldn't have much power without that money. Congress also couldn't force states to honor national policies and obligations. So essentially what you had were individual states acting as their own countries. Let's go over those weaknesses again in a quick review. 9 out of the 13 states needed approval to pass laws or ratify treaties, and 13 out of the 13 states needed to approve the amendment of articles. There was no central form of currency, no authority to collect taxes or money, and no authority to make states respect central policies and obligations. It's the failure of the Articles of Confederation that led to the ratification of the Constitution. First off, what is a constitution? A constitution presents the fundamental principles of a government and establishes the basic structure and procedure by which the government operates to fulfill those principles. The principles of our U.S. Constitution can be found in the preamble. The preamble reads, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." So what principles stand out here? We can point to justice. Ensuring domestic tranquility means maintaining peace and order. Providing for a common defense to provide security for the people. Promoting the general welfare means looking out for the collective good. And securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity means respecting liberty and ensuring that that is going to carry out to future generations. The major challenge of creating the Constitution was ensuring that the central government had some power, but it didn't become too powerful, still maintaining the power at the state level. Multiple states drafted plans, and we can see the differences in the types of plans that were presented based on their own interests. For example, smaller states like New Jersey wanted a one-house legislature, so they wanted to maintain that unicameral Congress. This is because they wanted equal representation in Congress. A bigger state like Virginia, however, believed that having two houses in the legislature would be most ideal, and it should be based on representation when it came to population. These larger states often had more people. The compromise between appeasing smaller states that wanted representation that was considered more equal and appeasing the larger states that wanted representation on population is where we get the Great Compromise, which was actually the Connecticut Plan, which we know is the Great Compromise. And so this uh, allowed for a two-house legislature to take hold, but one was based in equal representation. That's where we're looking at the Senate, and the other in population, and that's the House of Representatives. So every state gets two senators, and in each state, depending on their population size, they'll get more representatives. This led to the Three-Fifths Compromise, where states tried to increase their numbers in population by counting enslaved persons. Now, this is not very representative when you think about the fact that slaves did not have a say in their government, they could not vote. And so it was ironic that they were seen as being able to bolster these population numbers. But the Southern states benefited from the compromise as they gained greater representation in the House and overall in the Electoral College. The Constitution offered several remedies to the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. First, when we look at levying taxes, Congress now had the right to levy taxes on individuals. This allowed them to generate the money necessary to become more powerful. It also created a court system that dealt with issues between citizens and states. Congress had the right to regulate trade between states. They were able to create an executive branch that was headed by a president that got to choose a cabinet and also had checks on power from the judiciary and the legislature. Two-thirds of both houses and three-fourths of state legislatures could amend the Constitution or hold national conventions. And you had more representation when it came to the states as well. They were able to raise an army. They were able to address interstate commerce, so the federal government could step in to regulate that. They also resolved disputes between states, and they established this supremacy clause. So laws that were created through the Constitution at the federal level were also supreme above state laws. And then 50% plus one of both houses were necessary to pass laws that would eventually get to the president for approval. This brings us to the concept of dual sovereignty. And we can also look at dual federalism. And what this means is it's an attempt to try to maintain power at both the state level while still having power at the federal level. So, what this meant was any of the powers that were delegated to the states, they had sovereignty over and they were in control over. And if the power was delegated to the federal government, then it was sovereign in its power to deal with those issues. Now, today we have much more of a cooperative way of creating laws and making decisions. And so that would be seen more so as cooperative federalism as opposed to dual federalism. This figure 2.1, will help you better understand the difference between separation of powers and checks and balances. So when we look at the separation of powers, we're looking at everything that is delegated in the Constitution to each of the three branches of government. The checks and balances, however, are the limitations that each branch has on the other. This structure of government didn't only succeed in limiting the power of each of the branches, it also was seen as an attempt to limit the power of the federal government as a whole, essentially making it much more difficult to pass laws at the federal level. In the 1803 case, Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court interpreted Article 3 of the Constitution to mean that the court had the authority to determine whether an action taken by any government official or governing body violates the supreme law of the land of the Constitution. This power is known as judicial review, and it's a major check on the other two branches. Some other significant examples of checks would include the veto power that the president has under the executive branch. So even though the president doesn't directly make any policies, when a bill comes to their desk, they have the ability to sign that bill into law or they can veto it. Now, Congress can then go back and override that with 2/3 of a vote in both houses, but that does become increasingly challenging. Another example of a check is with respect to the legislature's checks on the executive. The Constitution gives the Senate the power of advice and consent. This is the power to approve or reject treaties and presidential appointments. The Senate's advice and consent also extends the president's judicial nominees as well. Now, not everyone was on board with establishing the Constitution. We can look to the Federalists and Anti-Federalists at the debate of whether or not the Constitution was the direction that the nation should go. In order to sell the Anti-Federalists on the Constitution, a Bill of Rights had to be added and included to protect the liberties of the people and maintain states' rights to make them feel more secure with moving forward and ratifying. Leading up to ratification, the Federalists made their most famous arguments in support of the proposed Constitution in a series of essays known as the Federalist Papers. They understood that Anti-Federalists had valid concerns that they needed to be able to address. Two of the most important Federalist Papers include Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. Federalist 10 addressed the concerns that were brought up by Anti-Federalists, primarily in the Brutus Papers, about the emergence of factions. The fear was that a large government would bring about many interests and could potentially lead to corruption that would violate the liberties of individuals. Federalist 10 argued, however, that factions were inevitable and having more of them actually led to more representation rather than less, as more perspectives would be considered. Federalist number 51 addressed concerns with the federal government becoming too big. It mainly defended the separation of powers and checks and balances as not being a threat to state governments, but rather being limitations to expanding the federal government. In addition, much state representation was needed in order to make any decisions at the federal level.